Well, hello there. You know.
So I'll ask you for the introduction, self-intro, and then I want you to tell us a story about the work.
Okay.
I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody. We're going to start in 1 minute. So thanks for joining for our first ever live from the galleries.
Yay.
My watch isn't telling me exactly the time.
Is that a Google Watch?
Are you ready to go live? Okay. Yep. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first ever live from the galleries at the Asian Art Museum. We're opening up and we're so excited to be here in real time in the museum with Afruz Amighi, who has just finished installing her new work, which is right behind us, My House, My Tomb. And I'm going to jump behind the camera to ask a bunch of questions. No pressure, Afruz. But thank you so much for playing along as we stream live to YouTube for the very first time from the museum. So I'm going to ask the first question here, and then I'm going to move behind camera. I want to ask you to give us a short self-introduction, and
Okay.
how did you decide to get into making sculpture and installation art?
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I, from a pretty early age, I guess, was always engaged in the arts, not in the formal sense, but I was always making things, whether it was like, out of sticks and acorns, like every child hopefully does. And then that became gingerbread houses and Easter eggs and anything that I could get my hands on. I sort of loved that. That sort of like losing yourself in something. And then when I grew up and wanted to do that for real, my family was not having that. They were like, "Oh, that was like great for when you're a kid and you have fun, but now you have to be a grown up." So I didn't go to art school until I was much older. Um, and then when I went to my graduate program, I was kind of like, oh, so now I'm going to learn how to make art and I quickly realized it was more like, now you're going to learn how to talk about art that you should already know how to make. So I kind of was a bit of an outsider to the whole art world.
Very interesting. And
Mm.
you talked about tinkering as a child, which was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. So thank you for talking about that. I definitely think school children visiting the museum will find this work really engaging. And I imagine they're going to want to lie down on the floor underneath it and things like that. So do you have any tips on viewing standpoints for kids and how we should think about engaging them in the work?
Um, I think one of the things about this piece that might be really fun for kids is that it's something that as you walk into the space, into the museum space, you see it in one really solid way where it looks kind of like some kind of house or some kind of abode. But if anyone sneaks around the side of the piece, it quickly becomes almost like a drawing that's hanging in space. So it kind of transforms from a sculpture or a house into like a bunch of lines, like as though they were just floating in the air. And I think that might be kind of cool for kids to experience.
That's a great recommendation to see it from different
Mm-hmm.
vantage points in the space. Which before we get to my next question about that, I wanted to first let you tell us the story behind the artwork.
Okay. So this piece was really inspired by the mythology that there's a lot of mythology surrounding the Taj Mahal in Agra in India, but there's this one particular myth that I read about and it just like completely gripped me. And it was this story that the king, Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal for his favorite wife who had passed as a tombstone for her, that he had it in his mind to create an identical version of the Taj Mahal um, to be situated across from the Taj Mahal, but that unlike the white marble Taj Mahal for his wife, that this Taj Mahal would be in black marble and it would be sitting across the river from the white Taj Mahal, and that's where he would be buried. And um, nobody knows if this, was like, if it's more legend or more like fact. There's no real archaeological evidence to support this myth. But what I loved about it was that it's a very well-known myth. It's something that thousands, if not millions of people, not just in India, but throughout the world have heard about. And so I just sort of imagined that there's a black marble Taj Mahal that exists in people's minds, in their imaginations all over the world. And there's one in my mind too. So let me actualize this. And let me tell you, it was nothing short of intimidating to use the Taj Mahal as a reference point for an artwork. I mean, it's a wonder of the world. It's epic. And so I was kind of like, do I really want to, use that as my reference point? But I kind of was so taken with the mythology that I thought, let me try to create this mirror image of the Taj Mahal. And so what you're seeing behind me is essentially this first piece here with all of its sort of archways is a representation of the existing Taj Mahal in the white marble. And then the sort of structure floating above it with the black mesh on it is my version, my imagination of what that unrealized architecture would have looked like. So that's really the story behind the piece. And I guess it's also a testament to me of like not just like imaginary architecture, but of this sort of obsessional love that he had for his wife that was just tantalizing.
Beautiful. Tell us a little bit about the materials you used. What is it, and what is it like to work with this material?
So this is the entire well, I have to say, okay, so in addition to the steel, the chains, and the mesh, one of the most important materials in this piece is the light. But I'll get to that in a little bit. The way that the piece was built was that I welded these strips of steel together to create the structure, and it was, you know, it, because the strips of steel are so thin, it was challenging that it didn't, like, so that it wouldn't always be breaking into pieces. That was the hardest part about this piece. Wasn't like the actual welding of it, but was like moving it a little here, moving it a little there, and having it not all fall apart. um in the upper part, that is fiberglass mesh, which is basically adhered to the steel. And that is a material that I found on a construction site. And I had seen it, I'd passed it on my way to the studio many times. And I always was like, I'm going to stop and ask the workers there what it is. And essentially, it's used to wrap buildings that are in the state of being built so that the rubble doesn't fall onto the people below. And I just thought it was like the most beautiful material. And I, at the time, stockpiled like a lot of it in my studio, and it just sat there for years. And then I finally just figured out what to do with it, how to use it. And so it, you know, made its debut in this sculpture, which is in a series of sculptures that uses this material. Which brings me to the light. As you can see, there's lots of shadows in this work. And I guess, you know, light is often seen sometimes by people as like an afterthought. But for me, it's really the main material that I work with. When the piece has no light, it feels as though it were naked. In fact, in my studio in Brooklyn, when I'm working on sculptures, I leave the lights on when I leave the studio at night. And my landlady is like, "You're crazy. That's expensive." And I'm like, "No, because they need it, because otherwise they'll look like really incomplete." She's like, "Nobody sees it." I'm like, "But I know that they're there and they're not looking their best without the light." So it's that integral to the piece for me. Probably the most important element.
Thank you for talking about the light, which is really stunning, and it must have been a big challenge in this space. And I just want to give a shout out. Was it Lauren Wright who did the lighting for your work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So shout out to our lighting designer and the whole preparations crew, Pete and his team, to install this. I'm sure there were challenges. Could you talk about the unique challenges installing in this location with natural light coming in from the side and all of the issues, and how has this work looked different in different spaces it's shown?
Well, so definitely, as you already shouted out to the installation team, because they made it just super seamless. It was, thank you. That was amazing. Because this particular building is landmarked, it was the public library of San Francisco. And so I think the biggest challenge for this piece was, how do you suspend something? How do you install something without, you know, like hanging it into the ceiling, like hanging it into the, you know, like marring the site specificity of the place. It's made out of travertine, these columns, these walls. It's an organic substance. I've never had this piece shown in a space like this. It's always been in kind of like a white gallery space where there was a lot of certainty about what it was going to look like when it was done. And so in this situation, I didn't know how the shadows were going to fall onto the travertine walls. I didn't know how the piece was going to look vertically because it's never been exhibited that way before. It's always been sort of exhibited side by side. So it was, there were a lot of unknowns, and I guess that's what makes like art so exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time, is that you don't really know what is going to happen next. And so it I didn't know it was going to have this kind of outcome in this space.
Well, thanks for being open to installing it here, even
Mm-hmm.
with all of the, changes that you had to make
Mm-hmm.
to the work. So I understand much of your work is inspired by architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Are there structures that are really working in your brain right now that you're really thinking about a lot?
Yes, I generally love religious architecture. So, and probably because I was raised in such a secular family where, there wasn't even like much superstition or like spiritual, like nothing, you know what I mean? It was kind of like, to me, when I enter a church or a temple or a mosque, I don't have any of that baggage that a lot of people who are brought up with religion like have around it. I just can purely enjoy the, usually what I find is to be like the opulence of this architecture of ritual and worship. And so I think what's been fascinating me for a long time is how so many different, let's just say in the south of Spain, there's most cathedrals that you go into have these remnants of design that indicate that their former life was as a mosque, and that before that it was as a cathedral. So they're almost like these Russian nesting dolls where they just change, depending on like who's in power. And I think that's, to me, what's so interesting about religious architecture is it sort of gives lie to this notion of purity, which is a lie in every realm of life. There's no such thing. It's just, if anything, it has the most negative consequences, that notion of that sectarianism. And so to me, I guess the fascination with religious architecture is its hybridity. A lot of times people will look at a sculpture and think of a cathedral or a mosque. It's kind of interchangeable, and I guess that's the point.
Wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned your family, and I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to ask you to tell us more about your being born in Iran and
Mm-hmm.
leaving as a child, and if you could talk about how that experience plays into your work.
Absolutely. I think when I was growing up, it was during the 80s. There was the hostage crisis in the United States. I came here as a very young child, and so there was really, my sister and I used to tell people, we just sort of made up. We were like, we're from Albania. We just chose that randomly because we were scared um, to say we were from Iran. And then when I grew a little bit older, that became an empowering identity for me to have. And identity is something that is just a constant shifting landscape. It's not fixed. You think it is. You really think this is who I am. This defines me. And then it falls apart. It falls away. And so I think it's influence come in my work. It's come out of my work. But you know, I have to say, like, growing up in homes in the United States that were covered, walls covered with carpets, because people do that. They hang carpets, and floors covered with carpets. And, that did leave a huge imprint on my psyche in terms of developing my aesthetic. So I think that's very, very real. When I went back to Iran as an adult, um, I definitely was that person who was like crying and like feeling very emotionally connected and all that. As I feel when I'm in New York too. So it's like I think so many people in these generations, it's like there is no such thing as like a fixed identity or nationality or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One question that's related. Are there historic sites in Iran that have inspired your work or artistic process?
Great. And I just wanted to tell the audience you are welcome to send your questions into the Q&A. And we have our first question from the audience. Are there historic sites in Iran that have inspired your work or artistic practice?
In Iran?
Yeah.
Absolutely. On one of my trips to Iran, well, on a few, I was in going through the south, and you know, I mean, it's undeniable when you go to Esfahan, when you go to Shiraz, you know, it's breath. Your breath is taken away by the sheer detail, the sheer delicacy, the delicate nature of monumental architecture. So, I mean, is there a specific mosque or palace? No, I think it was more of the sensibility in the South of how do you erect something so enormous and vast and have it be so subtle and delicate at the same time. That was like what moved me so deeply. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read in the Frist Museum Gallery Guide, you had a show there called The Presence of Your Absences Everywhere in 2017. Or I guess that was the title of the work, maybe?
The show, yeah.
The show.
Yeah.
That you've been making more figural work. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Yes. So, you know, in up until 2016, my work had been architectural. Then we had an election, presidential election, and my work just became figural. And I hadn't drawn figures since I was in high school, you know, like passing notes in classrooms. And it was like this very alien feeling, but it was all of a sudden this sense of like, okay, I've been inspired by architecture from Iran, from the Middle East for a long time now, but now I want people and I want to in my work, and I want to, how do I put this? I want to talk about things that are in the present for me. And so somehow my way of articulating like the current moment, American history, was through figuration. And I know that doesn't like make sense, but that's how it came out for me. And so I made a whole bunch of figurative work that to many people might look a bit abstract, but the figure was like the starting point for me in those pieces.
And has that work continued through the pandemic? And how have you been managing through the last year?
You know, it's true that as soon as the pandemic hit, or I mean, you know, like as it unfolded, I guess is a better way of putting it, my work changed back to being abstract and architectural. And it wasn't a conscious decision. I don't make a lot of conscious decisions when it comes to like making artwork. I just kind of, it's more intuitive. But I started going back to archways and architectural motifs and pattern work, and I can't explain it. Maybe if you ask me a year from now, I have a better answer.
Yeah, that's great. Are there more questions, Allison?
Can you talk about how the orientation of the work changes the interpretation of it? So stacked vertically as opposed to horizontally?
Oh, that's a really great question. The way I think I thought of it when it was exhibited horizontally was I thought of it more of as a reflection. And I guess there had been a story I had read about some archaeologists who had noticed that at a certain point in the day, when the Taj Mahal was reflected in the pool below it, it was like black. So it sort of conjured that mythology. But now that it's installed vertically, the way I think of it is much more in the spirit realm, so that it feels almost like the Taj Mahal is here with us, you know, in the earthly realm. It's sort of somewhat grounded. It's tangible in a way, and that what's sort of arising from it is its essence or its spirit, and that's kind of just drifting up into the ether in this version of the piece. So that's really the change for me. And I mean, I think it's really different in these different juxtapositions of it. Yeah.
For sure. Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, so in addition to the amazing sites you mentioned from Iran, are there other architectural sites throughout the world that have been inspirational to you?
Yes, I would say that rather than a specific site, more like architectural phenomenons that overlap from culture to culture have been really fascinating to me. So for example, there was a time when I was really obsessed with labyrinths and mazes, and with the fact that they would appear in different parts of the world, um, parts of the world in cultures that had no exchange or interaction with one another, yet somehow the same maze or labyrinth would, and those are two very different things, would just emerge somehow organically, and I thought that was fascinating. To be a little more specific, the labyrinth to me, as it was used in Christian ritual, was really interesting, as it was sometimes a labyrinth, which is different from a maze in the sense that a labyrinth guides you along its path to a final exit, whereas a maze, you can go down many different paths and hit a wall, and then you have to turn around and find your way out. It's nerve-wracking, where there's a labyrinth is more relaxing. This was often inlaid like a labyrinth in the floor of churches, and was used by pilgrims who couldn't go on pilgrimages to reenact this journey of pilgrimage through the labyrinth. And I just thought that was beautiful.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is the fun one. Do you have a guilty pleasure, or how do you restore and replenish your creative well?
Okay, so my guilty pleasure is that, and I do it often, is when I'm in the studio and I'm doing work that could be described as like kind of like tedious, you know, just like kind of like mindless labor. I half watch, but mostly listen to episodes of Monk, which, if anyone knows, I know this is like something that not many people, but so it's shot in San Francisco, and he's the obsessive compulsive detective, and I'm made, a lot of fun is made of me for this, but it's like I just over and over, I know them by heart. So that's my guilty pleasure. How I rejuvenate is I go in New York, okay, to the beach. I know that sounds like awful to most people, you know, a New York beach, but it's quite beautiful in the Rockaways. And I will make the trip like an hour and a half there, an hour and a half back by bus, train, walking, just to get to that moment where, you know, you are sort of embraced by the sand and the water and the smell and everything. That's sort of my place. So yeah.
That's awesome. Oh, there is one more question.
Okay.
Is there an intended dialogue between your piece and Collected Letters by Liu Jianhua, which is next to it? You can't see it. Our audience at home cannot see this, but they're on opposite sides of the loggia here, this space where My House, My Tomb is installed.
To be honest, there wasn't like a conscious dialogue between the two works. Like when I was thinking about this work, I wasn't thinking, how do I sort of like engage with that work? But I do think it's interesting that despite that, both works are suspended. And in addition to that, there's a work, and I don't know the artist's name, but it's a beautiful work that's to the left of in the museum that's also suspended and is made out of similar materials as well. So I think this theme of suspension is definitely there.
The piece you're talking about is by a local artist, Jen Chongbin.
Oh, it's yeah.
So I think many in our audience are familiar with that piece as well, but there's wonderful images on the museum's website of that piece, which we actually can't see from here, but if we walked around the loggia, we would be able to see it. Yeah.
And I will say that when I saw that piece, I felt like it was like flying pages of paper, and that the letters had sort of amassed from the paper into the installation over here. So that was definitely at least my takeaway from that, my impression.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Someone did muse that Collected Letters is flowing downward while My House, My Tomb is sort of rising
so
upward.
nice.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
That's beautiful.
Lovely,
yeah,
lovely vision.
it's really nice.
Well, I'll come back on camera just to say a farewell and thank you so much for agreeing to do this kind of experimental new program with us. And we want to hear from all of you in the audience to see what you thought and if we should do this again. But it's been a pleasure getting to know you and learn more from you.
Thank you. That was really fun, everybody. Thank you. Yay.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great weekend. Bye.